So these guys are crazy. These Democrats are morons when it comes to policy. This policy is terrible. We are an energy-rich state in coal and in natural gas and in oil.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel. We're joined by Jeff Berkowitz from Public Affairs TV in Chicago. And Jeff, the month of June is supposed to be a quiet month with the legislature having gone home and staying home, but that's not happening right now. As we tape this, we just had a 2-day special session that was supposed to be addressing an energy bill that the governor and others wanted passed. But it kind of blew up despite the fact that the Democrats hold supermajorities in the House and Senate. The energy bill didn't go through.
Well, you know, when you have too many mouths to feed, when the Democratic Party is so freaking large in terms of supermajorities, you're going to have Democrats against Democrats. That's what held this up. The energy bill ran out of gas, and they couldn't get it over the goal line. Don Harmon was concerned that he might have some members who were getting to be in trouble from time to time. They might be in a close Republican district, and maybe people there in that district were not as fond of having the wonderful Illinois climate change policy that the governor wants while they're losing their jobs, because this bill had something that a natural gas company was threatening to pull out tomorrow. If this was in the bill, they said, we're out of here. Okay, it wasn't the deadline that we're going to terminate natural gas production by 2045. It was the deadlines leading up to that would phase out his company way earlier than it was going to be complete or exhausted. So the point of it is, you cannot pass energy legislation that basically says, we don't give a damn that you're going to be out of a job. We don't give a damn that actually your reliability for the grid is not so good. So this was the woke call, different kind of woke call, to the Illinois Democratic Party that maybe they're too woke.
Well, let me bring up for the viewers here. Again, this is something we showed last week. You got to understand, folks, a little bit about where our electrical generation comes from. The majority, as you see in yellow, is from nuclear. Illinois is the #1 nuclear state in the nation for generation of electricity using nuclear power. About a third of our power comes from the use of coal, and roughly 10%, just under 10%, comes from natural gas. So when the environmentalists were wanting to have a green energy deal where they're going to put Illinois on the path of getting rid of fossil fuels, that means you're going to be eliminating approximately 40% of the state budget. And, this is some people are going, what are you talking about? How's that going to happen? Let me play a little bit of what Governor Pritzker said. By the way, the date on this is wrong. It was actually yesterday, the 16th. The date is off by a day. But the governor spoke to the press and made a couple of comments about the failure of the energy bill to pass. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Our long-term goal is to create meaningful climate change policy that makes Illinois a leader in protecting our people, the environment, and the clean energy industry that we can grow. I will not sign a bill that does not match the gravity of this moment. That means that a bill claiming to contain meaningful decarbonization measures, but does not pass muster on the details and does not move us toward a clean energy economy is not a real climate bill.
So the governor is talking about climate, and Jeff, a lot of his critics say, what is this guy talking about? Illinois is not going to impact the climate. You have China building 2 coal-fired power plants every week. And we can't put borders up to keep the air, from coming from other states, or for that matter, coming from other countries. In fact, going back to when you and I were kids, people remember that there was the nuclear radiation from bombs going off in the Pacific that would come over the country, nuclear fallout. So now I suppose we're dealing with coal fallout. But, you know, a lot of the governor's critics are saying the governor's just virtue signaling, and maybe that he's just trying to establish his bona fides as an environmentalist, if you want to be cynical, that maybe he's looking for higher office, maybe run for the White House down the roads, and he wants to say, hey, I was a green governor. So, but either way, the governor's trying to say, you know, we should be moving away from our fossil fuel.
Yeah, in support of that, as we started to tape this show on today, June 17th, 2 days from Juneteenth, it was announced that Dan Hines is out of here. He was the deputy governor, focusing on the deputy governor for the state of Illinois, the number one person focusing on the budget, but also for legislative affairs. He's now gone. Could it have something to do with the governor being upset that his energy legislation didn't pass, that we didn't have the Springfield-Chicago Accord instead of the Paris Accord? So Hines is gone and Andy Menor is in, okay? Because Andy knows how to get things through. Well, maybe, Governor, wasn't Dan Hines' fault. Maybe it was the wrong policy. Maybe Don Harmon just doesn't take the view you have that, well, we don't really care if somebody's in trouble in a district.
Let me share.
Don's concern is his senators in his caucus, his Democratic senators in his caucus. And if one of those or several of them
how many Republicans are in the Senate, Jeff?
Well, 18, but there might be 41 to 18. But Harmon, you know, look, like Madigan before in the House.
Yeah, so the bottom line for the viewers, they have to understand the Democrats with an overwhelming majority. Now, because this is special session, you needed a bit more votes, but they couldn't get their own members to vote for this because they were caught, the Democrats were caught between, as Don Harmon said, that's not me making it up, I don't have a bite of this, but Don Harmon in a press briefing said, the environmentalist community is an important part of our power base. He didn't use that term, but and as are the unions. And so the Democrats were caught in between there. And I heard that secondhand. I heard that Harmon just told the governor, "Look, you're trying to rush this through, and you know we don't have our ducks in a row here. You know, you're trying to go too fast for your purposes, and you know it isn't going to fly," and it didn't.
What Harmon was talking about was written about by Steve Daniels and Cranes yesterday. A good story about the natural gas-fired plant in Grundy County that was saying if this bill goes through, because it has language in there that they thought would give people the power to start raising the requirements to be more decarbonized. And the CEO for Competitive Power Ventures was saying, look, when you start without a lot of carbon, we're pretty clean. And you have some across the board requirements that say everybody, whether you started clean or not, you're going to maybe phase in 20% more clean. That's not going to be something we can do profitably. So we're out of here. All of our employees that are here now working on construction jobs that the unions want are out of here. And you know what? That caught Harmon's eye, and he said, I'm not doing this. And the governor's upset. That's why I said too many mouths to feed. A bit too big a caucus. You can't please everybody. He can't control his own legislation. Before he runs for president, he better do a good job as governor. And right now he's in trouble.
Look, let me. We heard at the beginning of the show a small clip from Jeanne Ives. I interviewed Jeanne Ives about 5 days ago on this, prior to the lawmakers coming back to Springfield to vote on this. And she makes some interesting points on a bite I'm going to say. And one of the things, just to pre-stage what she's saying here, you know, folks, what kind of a furnace do you have in your basement? I bet it's natural gas. What kind of a stove? You're either going to have electric stove or a gas stove. And, you know, Ives is making the point. You guys, you governor can be the green governor and say you're going to be dealing with climate change, but are you going to take all these gas appliances out of people's homes across the state? And you're obviously not. Let's just take a listen to what Jeanne Ives had to say on this issue.
If you want to bring in a bailout for nuclear again, then you're going to have to buy off some legislators for other things that they may want. And so they're going to the green legislators and they're buying them out, saying, we're going to get rid of coal, all coal generation by 2035 in the state, all gas generation by 2045. The truth is you're not going to, if you get rid of that generation, which I honestly don't think they're going to do, because the consumer prices would be outrageous, and the market, you can't replace that in any way in Illinois, so you're just going to be importing it from other states, like Tim Butler said, which will spike prices. But here's the deal. I'm sorry, I'm not giving up my gas dryer. I'm not giving up my gas cooktop. I'm not giving up my gas furnace, and nobody else in the state of Illinois is either. So just because you shut down production in the state of Illinois doesn't mean we're not going to still have gas coming into our homes. So these guys are crazy. These Democrats are morons when it comes to policy. This policy is terrible. We are an energy-rich state in coal and in natural gas and in oil. And we have a lot of nuclear plants, but you know what we're doing? We're not building more nuclear to replace coal and gas. We're trying to salvage whatever nuclear we can with a bailout to Exelon, parent company of ComEd, caught doing dirty deals with Madigan and Company, allegedly. Let me add the allegedly in. But obviously there's people that have already been indicted for this type of deal making that's unethical. And so Exelon's being the heavy in here, and they are trying to still get another bailout even though they're in trouble.
So Jeanne Ives laying out what she says is the problem with it, and I think she made some interesting points there, Jeff. And I mean, how many people are going to be, having their gas turned off on the furnace? You can't, how are you going to be heating your home? I mean, there's just some practical applications here that I think are often overlooked. And Jeff, let me get another bite in here. One of the few things that did happen in the state legislature, there was a committee hearing. They had a man, Mr. Kurt Morgan, who is the CEO of a company called Vistra Corporation. He actually grew up in Illinois, as an aside. But this is a relatively small bite, about 20 seconds. But the thing is, folks, when you have wind and solar, those are not energy sources that are always available. Obviously, the sun goes down, and then you don't have solar power at night. So if you're going to turn your lights on with wind and solar, you have to have battery backup, and that's what Mr. Morgan is talking about.
One other heads up as people watch this, note what he talks about. I think you have that in the bite. In California, when they started doing things, they weren't really prepared. We're not really prepared. We don't have a plan.
And he it's a good point, because in California, he's talking about California, and you got to operate with batteries. And number one, the batteries, like all batteries, are only going to hold power for so long. So, the average person has to understand what are the implications for them as consumers. That how are you going to be charging your, let's say, electric vehicle that the environmentalists want us to go to? Maybe that's a great thing, but how are you going to charge your electric vehicle in your home overnight if the whole grid is being powered by batteries? I mean, these are practical things. And as Mr. Morgan points out, and as Jeff, California, because they had an over-reliance on these moving too fast, they've had brownouts and blackouts where they just have to shut the grid off in certain areas because they don't have the power to distribute it.
California overbuilt solar, and what's happening there now is that overbuild of solar has shut down other forms of generation in the state. They don't have enough generation when the sun goes down, and they're rapidly trying to build batteries.
He says, batteries are part of the transition. But I think people need to understand that the electric grid using fossil fuels and using nuclear, as we showed you earlier, those are power sources that are always on. And so when we flip the switch, the power's there. Jeff, the key is here, and again, for people to understand, is that there is not a really good source of storing power. All the power that we use has been produced a second ago and is running through the grid on a constant basis. There's no storing. There's no like water where you have a dam and you hold water back in reserve. There's no means of doing that in any appreciable way for electrical power. You can do it for in a limited area with batteries for a limited amount of time. But for those of us who are accustomed to having the power always on, all the time, 24/7, going to wind and solar might be good politically, but it a lot of people telling me in the power industry that it's just not doable.
Illinois currently gets more than 30% of its electricity from coal. This bill says you're going to end coal production in Illinois in 2035. That means you're going from more than 30% to zero. What are the plans? Will this be phased out? How would it be phased out? So that's one. I haven't heard people tell me about that. Maybe that's in this bill they're trying to pass, but I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the discussions. I haven't seen the legislative reports. I haven't seen anything. So call me skeptic. I just don't know that there's a plan. I don't know that there's an analysis. I don't know there's any thought. Because frankly, I don't have a lot of confidence in the 177 General Assembly members in the House and the Senate that they are knowledgeable about what you're talking about, Terry, that they are knowledgeable about the grid, that they're knowledgeable about the batteries that must be in production and ready to take place. If we're going to go to wind and solar, is it wind and solar going to pretty much completely replace carbon and natural gas and nuclear? Because I don't know, folks. They're talking nuclear is much more expensive. That's why they require subsidies. Is Illinois going to always be a non-competitive state because we're relying on things that are more costly than elsewhere? I don't know. I haven't seen any of this. I haven't seen a thing.
Well, and you know what? It's not just nuclear. I mean, the thing is wind and solar. I don't have the current price differentials, but I know some years ago when I was doing a story on this, coal, as I recall, was like 4 cents a kilowatt, where wind and solar were closer to like 28 cents. I mean, to give you an idea, they were much more expensive.
I think a lot of that's narrowed, but again, I shouldn't be what I think. I want to see the legislative analysis. I want to see the legislative discussion. Why isn't it happening? I'd like to see the governor talk about that. Let's just put for one day climate change aside and have him come on and say, Jeff, here's what the production is going to look like in 2025 and in 2029. Are we phasing out coal? Yes. And here's how it's going to happen. And here's how the replacement of wind and solar and whatever is going to come in. Just do that, Governor. Let's hear you talk about it.
You know, this is the thing. I put something on Facebook before the lawmakers came in. And this was my point. I don't think that we have briefed the lawmakers, and I don't think that we've raised this issue, which is so significant when we're talking about fundamentally changing the way we produce power in the state of Illinois from a reliability factor, from a cost factor, and the impact that that will have on retirees. Again, I think this issue must really be flushed out. Let me go, Jeff, one of the things, talking about messing things up and rushing things through, the lawmakers in May passed the budget, $42.3 billion. I don't remember how many pages, but it was close to it might have been over 1,000 pages. I don't have the number. It was a big bill. And the point is that they didn't look at it carefully enough in their rush. And they found out that the start date for the budget and the fiscal year for the state of Illinois begins on July 1. And so that budget passed in May was supposed to fund the state from July 1 through June 30 of next year. They found out that the effective date, the budget wouldn't have under law started until June of next year, which means we would have had no budget for 11 months. So lawmakers, the governor had to do an amendatory veto. The lawmakers had to, in the House and Senate, support that so that the state budget that was passed this past May would in fact go ahead and start in July 1. The Republicans made a lot of hay about this, and one of those was Mike Marin. Mike Marin is a Republican lawmaker from Danville. He was one of three who were speaking on this. And they were rubbing the nose of the Democrats who screwed this up for political points. But Marin made a larger point, that it's not just the budget that gets screwed up. There's a whole lot of things that just aren't working right in the Illinois state government and the process. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Many of these controversial items, just like the state budget, were given next to no time for floor debate. The bill dramatically changing law enforcement was allowed 2 voices of opposition during the debate. A little over 2 weeks ago, this year's almost $43 billion budget passed with many unanswered questions. It passed up against the deadline, and only Leader Dimmer was allowed a few brief minutes to question its provisions. This is the worst kind of process. I won't even call it a democratic process because it doesn't deserve that title. I was appalled after being in county government, seeing how business was conducted in Springfield. My shock has now turned to shame. The people of the state of Illinois deserve better than this.
This ties into what Mike Maron's saying, ties into what we were just talking about on energy. And Mike Maron was saying he used to be the head of the county government over by Danville. He's now representing the city of Danville in that area. But he said, when I put together as the county chairman my budget for the county, we would put it out and publish it 30 days before we held a vote. And he's proposing that we have the same thing for the state budget. And as he was saying in that bite, that it's not just the budget, it's all of these critical issues that just aren't given enough light of day. They're making the point that the Democrats who are in control of the state government don't want transparency because it makes them easier to pass bills that would be otherwise unpopular. Now, what's interesting, Jeff, is yesterday Governor Pritzker signed a bill on Juneteenth, making it a state holiday. And what I was unaware of until yesterday afternoon is then the U.S. House of Representatives also passed it to make it a national holiday. Lieutenant Governor Jeanne Ives spoke at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. A whole other bunch of speakers spoke on the bill signing. Let's listen to what she had to say and why it matters.
In the face of mass incarceration and ever-increasing wealth gaps and a pandemic that laid bare the long-time inequities in housing and education and healthcare, that we will never stop fighting for freedom. Neither the Emancipation Proclamation nor the Declaration of Freedom on the first Juneteenth, and not even the 13th Amendment, allowed us as Black people to fully embody the freedom that we all deserve. Rather, we celebrate Juneteenth to acknowledge the deep faith and strength of our ancestors that propelled us to this moment. And it is a time to come together in every community of our state to recommit to and work towards the highest ideals of freedom for all.
I want to know who in the state legislature is taking the lead to say, I want to see something done in Chicago once and for all. I don't want to see violence getting worse. Are we prosecuting people who are engaged in these activities? Yeah, those are some of the questions we should be asking on Juneteenth.
Yeah, Jeff, it's interesting that, as I mentioned, the black slaves back in 1865 weren't taught to read, so they didn't know. And, we have repeatedly seen, especially in Chicago school, how many, I don't know if you know offhand, how many students are not even graduating. And we often find that those who do graduate, who get a high school degree, they're sadly often are functionally illiterate.
6% of those minorities, 6%, maybe 8%, at best 10% of those minorities finish a 4-year college program in the next 6 years. 70% in third grade of minorities are not reading at grade level, That's been true in 2000, it's been true now.
Say again, how many are not reading at grade level?
Are not 70%, Terry, 70%. You know what whites would say in Winnetka if we told them 70% of your kids in the Winnetka public schools aren't reading at grade level? I know, I was there. They would have a revolution. That's what we need, a revolution that says we're not going to tolerate this in the inner cities of Illinois anymore. That's what we need on Juneteenth.
Well, and as you have said, school choice is something that the Republican under Governor Rauner, they started a very small kind of sample school choice program. Governor Pritzker wants to end that. So, we can pass and say this is a national holiday, and that's fine, and it's fine to have a recognition of history and values and all that. That's why I love history. But when we bring it to today and we want to talk about racism and we want to talk about the lack of opportunities, why is it in so many schools, whether it's in Chicago on the south side, on the west side, East St. Louis, across this country, Baltimore, we see repeatedly that we have so many in the black community, the students are going to failing schools. And, I think that ought to be part and parcel of this discussion. Why are they failing, and why not, as so many other people have said, that the alternatives is say, give their families a choice. If you and I, Jeff, were forced to go to a garage mechanic who was an alcoholic and couldn't do his job, we would go to a different mechanic. It's that simple. If you go to a restaurant, you don't like the food, you go to a different restaurant. But when it comes to schools, nope, you got to go to the school in your district, no matter how bad it is. And that's what people have been pointing out for years.
Yeah, right, and that's an issue that ought to be discussed statewide on the governor level. We ought to hear the governor of the state of Illinois, who happens to be a Democrat, talk about that. The Republican primary for the Republican gubernatorial primary in Illinois now goes another year till June 28th. We ought to hear the current 3 gubernatorial candidates talking about that, and maybe we need some new entrants to come in if they're not going to do it. Talk about school choice, talk about improving that terrible statistic. 70% of the minority kids, inner city schools, CPS and otherwise in Illinois, do not read at grade level. Do something about it. Do something about the union power, the teacher union power that shut down the schools, the public schools for much of the last year needlessly, and wants the power to shut down private schools in the future, which they didn't have now. Let's do something about these things. That's the stuff that the legislature should be focusing on. Climate policy.
This is another thing, going back to
I don't
Mike
think so.
Marin, his point, we need to have more debate, folks. Jeff and I are not saying how you should vote or what the right policy is, but whether it's policing or energy or education, the way this state is being run right now, where they throw things up behind the scenes, they don't really air it, they don't allow the public to even understand what's going on, and then they make these major changes in a subsequent, in the future, Jeff and I will be talking about things you may not have heard of, some of the sex education that was just passed that is happening in schools. And I think it's time for the citizens of Illinois, as Representative Marin said, to have a government that's worthy of the people and allows them to be participating by getting the word out. And that's, it's hard to defend the news media. We try, but it's hard to do that when you have these bills that aren't even published, like this energy bill. Last Friday, we still hadn't seen this, and then they bring it to a vote in the Senate on Tuesday. How are you going to educate the public?
Terry, we got to get out. We got to remind people the one thing they did do, the one thing they did essentially, they passed this legislation. Boy, this is a really important thing. By 2027, we're in 2021 now. By 2027, we'll have a fully elected school board in CPS. And great. So they passed that. It's going to be held up for some discussion through the end of June before it goes to the governor. We'll let people know that.
Do we know if the
But
governor's going to
important thing-
sign that? I think he's in favor of it, isn't he?
Well, of course he will sign it. He ran on it. It's one of the dumbest things. We don't have time to discuss that. Like, that's going to fix the 70% who don't read.
Well,
it
that's
very
not going to,
We
but
get-
on the other hand,
We get 21 members on a school board. Like, who thought that was a good idea? The point is, Terry, we got to
Yeah,
get
we
out.
gotta get
gotta
out.
Remind people. We got to
we'll talk about that next time.
If you like that show, if you like this show, like us on Facebook. And with that, we'll remind people to come on next week. We'll probably get back to sex ed.
All right, Jeff,
We'll
we'll
find
talk
out.
to you later.